Hi, it's Nick Astor with TriplePundit.com here at the Fortune Brainstorm Green 2013 conference. I am here with the sustainability team from International Paper, James McDonald and Terry Shanahan. And let's just start with one of these pressing environmental questions, a classic that people have been concerned about forever, and that's deforestation.
Yep.
And there's a lot of causes of deforestation. Does the paper industry in general still play a role in the general deforestation issue?
That's a really good question, Nick, and I'm so glad you brought it up. A lot of people are justifiably concerned about the world's forests and the fact that we are continuing to lose forest cover in some parts of the world. The good news is that where there is a vibrant, active, healthy forest products industry, like in North America and Europe, and increasingly in South America, the existence of the demand for forest-based products creates the ongoing need to continue to grow trees on the same acre of land. And so it's the antithesis of deforestation. It's actually maintaining forests as forests. So what really causes deforestation is primarily the humans' needs to eat and be housed. And so what we're finding is, and understanding in the last couple of decades really, is that agriculture is the primary driver. Another big one is mining. So our need to dig stuff up out of the ground, which we all need. It's part of our modern lifestyle. And certainly we all need to eat. So it presents really interesting challenges as the Earth grows its human population by a lot over the next couple of decades. What's going to happen to that? More land is going to be needed for more food production and other items. And the expectation from groups like the World Wildlife Fund, who have done a projection out through 2050, is that we'll lose a very significant amount of forested land as a result of that pressure on the land. Part of their solution is to grow our industry. And so actually the forest products industry is a way to maintain forests. When you think about that, it just makes total sense, because a pulp mill costs about $1 billion. And each paper machine that goes in next to it costs about $250 million. So when you put that much of an investment in the ground, you really need to make sure, number one, that you have a sustainable supply of trees available for a long period of time. Usually you're thinking many, many decades, and in some cases more than 100 years. So it's a really long-term horizon business.
And in the longer term horizon, it is a global issue, but as Terry describes, most of the wood that comes into the paper mills for paper and packaging comes from about 70 to 80 miles away. So when you put that $1 billion in the ground and you have the investment, it's not that you're driving several thousand miles to get this wood. So you have to make sure that that sustainably managed source of that raw material is obviously vibrant. It obviously benefits the communities that are there as well. So one of the areas that we continue to focus on is, globally, I guess 10% of the fiber is certified. So we'd like to focus on looking at more certified fiber globally to match up with the work that we're doing in the different regions around the world with our operations.
Yeah, we think that's a really good way to make sure that you're managing the forest properly. So not just that you have the forest cover and it's there, but that it's actually being managed in the right way.
So this makes a lot of sense to me. At least we can be fairly confident that in the developing world things are being managed appropriately from the perspective of the impact of the forest products industry specifically. And it makes sense to me. I see this long-term investment, and it's very logical. Right. You mentioned certification. What is certification? How do nonetheless, you're going to be asked to prove it. You're going to be asked to prove why. What is a properly managed forest? What are the factors? What are the questions that people ask? And how do you actually prove that, yes, our acreage is indeed responsible, whatever that means?
Well, it's interesting. I guess probably 6 years ago, we owned about 10 million acres in the United States, and that only supplied about 20% of the fiber that we needed. So we still had a huge supply chain of about 80% of the fiber needs from private landowners. We no longer own that land, but we still have long-term contracts and relationships with those suppliers. And when you look at those contracts and you say, well, there's certification, what does that mean? There are different types of certifications. There's the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, the Forest Stewardship Council. Different parts of the world have different national standards. In Brazil, there's Surflor, there's a Polish standard, a French standard. And the key elements of all of that are around the sustainability and the management of and replanting of those forests. So there's stream side zone management. You don't cut certain areas, you don't cut certain times of the year. And when we own the land, we manage it that way. Well, that's fine. But now you're asking us, how do you prove that? Well, there's third parties. So there's a certification body, a PricewaterhouseCoopers, a Bureau Veritas that would come in and based on a set of criteria would audit against that and assure you as the third party that the label on the product meets these different standards for the sustainably managed forest.
And most of those practices were built in the U.S. over the last 5 or 6 decades. And primarily the state forest services are the ones that actually were part of helping the forest products industry create those best management practices, which have now been translated into these certification standards. So they've been around for a long time. They've been added to and refined and made stronger over time. But all of these things just make perfect sense if you think, I want to generate income off this land for the next 100 years and be able to pass this down to the next generation. Because in the U.S., that's actually a big part of what's happening is that generations are turning over and the families that own the land, the grandparents are passing on and the next generation is choosing not to remain in the supply of trees to the forest products industry. They're selling the land. Or converting it to agriculture or something that's a faster cash cycle than wood. And almost everything is a faster cash cycle than wood. So we understand the temptation to do that. I think the Forest Service estimates, is it 40 million acres?
Probably
I think their number is 40 million acres over the next decade could be lost to
generational transition.
So conversion to non-forest uses.
As more people move into the cities, they're less in the rural areas, they're further removed from that land base.
Right.
And so that generational turnover will affect our supply at some point.
And can you simplify a little bit what are the factors though? I mean, I know there's a lot of different standards and you got your own standards and so on, but what are the main factors that you'd tally up to say, yes, we know this is responsibly managed? I want to go back to that just a little bit. Is it certain inclines you don't cut, we leave some old growth in certain places? Is it about measuring, whether we have a functional ecosystem rather than just a monoculture tree farm? I mean, what are the bullet point
all of
factors?
That. It's protecting wildlife, it's protecting water, it's really taking care of the land. And so there's a set of standards for sort of harvesting, because that's, when you really have a lot of impact, you bring heavy equipment in and you harvest trees. It's really important that that's done the right way, because if it's not, it can have a really detrimental impact. But also then in the replanting, there are also a lot of guidelines around what to do after the harvest has taken place. And James, do you want to talk about the state implementation committees, because you're closer to that?
Well, as part of the forestry management of the different states, they have best management practices, and through the SFI program, they have the state implementation committees that will come in and they'll advise, as we said earlier, stream side management, so the harvesting, the planting. The real big piece about this, though, is that there's a plan, right? So that you're not just cutting and leaving it. You may let it naturally regenerate in 2 to 3 years. You may come back and replant. But each one of those plans manage for the different ecosystems and the biodiversity in that area. So if there's a plant or a salamander or a bird, it is taken into consideration in that whole sort of framework, patchwork, quilt, if you will, of the forest lands. And so they're managed for those different things. So yes, it's the yield of the crop, it's the biodiversity, it's how we cut, or how they cut, and how we get supplied. And
in the U.S., we contribute several $100,000 to these state forestry initiatives that are really focused on helping landowners understand what they, this precious resource that they have control over, and help them manage it correctly, because most of them aren't foresters. So they really need some advice, and so we fund a lot of that work and that counseling.
So building on that, I guess my last question is, what you're talking about is really stakeholder engagement. You've got the landowners, you've got the users of the land, you've probably got all kinds of NGOs involved, the customers, etc. Do you have an established stakeholder engagement strategy? Have you, who are the groups you're working with, and what kind of results have you had?
Well, it's interesting. We've really started and more of the engagement piece with potentially skeptics. It's very easy to be along with the people that you get along with, and so one of the challenges we've had is engaging some of the people or some of the groups that have not been big fans of international paper historically. And in doing this, we've learned a lot as far as collaborative agreements, as far as working together. We see that in, as you mentioned, the stakeholder with the state, foresters, landowners, but we also look not just in the United States but around the world for global partnerships. Like WWF, the Global Forest Trade Network, things like that, where we can leverage some of the practices that we have here with the other practices that we have around the world, and build that more of a solid foundation around what is international paper and how do we ensure that we have that sustainable supply of fiber and a variety of other things, safe employees, water, solid waste, all the different things that involve around our footprint. We work with different stakeholders in different regions on those different topics.
But I would say, as you asked the question about strategy, I would say that's evolving. So I think we would self-describe ourselves as having been a bit remote and removed from the external groups. It isn't new for us to engage with our employees and particularly the communities where we operate, and certainly the families that supply us wood. That's been going on for a long, long time. But reaching out to sort of other third-party groups, and particularly those focused on the environment. So the Dogwood Alliance has been one of those that's come about and has really, I think, surprised both of us with how much common ground there actually is when you have two groups that are passionate about forests and protecting forests. They come at it from very different perspectives, but there still is really a lot of common ground, and that's been a big surprise, and we're building on that. Yeah.
Well, Terry and Jim, thanks so much for walking us through the basics, and it's good to get to know you.
Thanks.